After 4 months, my camera search has finally come to an end. I decided to go with the Sony Burano. Now, in this video, I want to talk about why I decided to go with this camera. I want to give some real life tips and some reviews of using this camera for the last 6 months or so, talk about how I rigged the camera and some of my camera choices, and then talk about some of the downfalls of the camera, but why the pros outweighed the downsides. 4 months ago, I sold my Red Monstro, and that was a pretty hard decision. I had some injuries that kind of led me into that decision, but there was also some other things of why I sold that camera. First of all, the DSMC2 cameras have been discontinued, and Red has moved on to the DSMC3. With that discontinuation, Red no longer repairs those cameras, and whenever I sold the camera, there was no new media being made for that, and that's part of the reason of my decision. Now, since I sold the camera, there has been a new company pop up. I've seen their Facebook ads, and they're advertising a new media for those cameras, which is pretty cool to see some legacy cameras getting new media. But those were a couple reasons for that decision. So really, the camera was overall a little bit too heavy and a little bit too large for a lot of my workflow. The Monstro sensor is literally one of my favorite sensors that I've ever shot on. It's a really good camera, so it kind of hurt to see it go, but in terms of workflow, it just wasn't fitting the jobs that I'm working on right now. Whenever I decided to sell that camera, I started immediately looking at different cameras and what would be my next option. I knew NAB was coming up, so I figured there would be some new cameras coming up, and then I had already started using the Burano on a few different sets. So the Burano was the end goal, but I wasn't sure if I really wanted to invest that much money into it, and I'll get into that later. After I sold that camera, I started testing different cameras to see which camera would fit my workflow best. I tested the Sony Burano on a few different shoots. I tested the Blackmagic Cine Ursa 12K. I got hands on the Pixis 12K and the Red V Raptor at NAB. And then I tested a few other cameras while I was in the market. Over the course of those months, I went back and forth on which camera I thought would be a good fit for me. I thought maybe the Pixis 12K, and then I thought maybe the Ursa Cine, but then I decided the Ursa Cine was too heavy. I thought maybe the Kinefinity, but after some more thought, the Kinefinity I don't think was a good fit just because of the potential liability of not being able to repair or having the camera out for a long time. I like to run these cameras as much as I can so that they can make their money back. And so with all of that and debating back and forth, I kept thinking I would love to have a Sony Burano, but the Sony Burano kits were just a little bit too expensive for me at the time. But I kept pushing forward and kept keeping my eye out on the market. Recently, I woke up one morning and I was browsing a few groups. I saw a Sony Burano kit being sold that included media, and it was cheaper than buying the camera brand new. Now, the camera had sub 100 hours. I think it was around 40 something, which was really impressive, and they had really taken care of the system. I had been keeping my eye out, and I had not seen a lot of used Burano kits going up for sale. So whenever I saw that, I jumped on the opportunity. I started talking with them, and here we are. Over those months before I found this kit, I had been going back and forth on which camera would be my next move. Because there is some downsides to this camera, but I want to talk about why I decided to go with the Sony Burano. I primarily work in commercial, corporate, and tourism. Now, to find a camera that fits all of those niches pretty well can be difficult, because with some of the commercial gigs, I really need to rig the camera up. And then with some of the corporate and dock work, I really need to have a slimmed down system. Having a camera that can check both of those boxes, being rigged up really big with a lot of accessories without many sacrifices, and then being rigged down really small or stripped down really small without having a lot of sacrifices, was really the main selling point for this camera. So let's talk about that. For me, this camera is really versatile for both solo and crew work. This camera can be rigged up. It's got a lot of accessories. It's got a built-in PL mount. It's got some power distro options if you buy different plates, but it can also be rigged down really small. You can run it with autofocus primes, no peripherals. Literally, it feels almost like an FX6 whenever it's completely stripped down. I've been in the Sony ecosystem for about 4 years now, and I've shot on every camera that Sony offers, from the FS7 all the way up into the newest bodies, excluding the Venice 2, although I've had hands on it at NAB. But with that in mind, I'm very familiar with the color science, reliability, and how they work. Now, the user interface is one downside. I'm going to include that here right now because I remember when I first got my Sony FX6, a buddy of mine, Clark, had talked me into getting it, and I remember opening up the camera, shooting something with it, and then texting him immediately that day saying, I'm returning this thing. I hate this user interface. Sony's user interface could obviously use some work, but with this camera, they've improved it a little bit. They've added the Big 6 menu, which is also coming to the FX3 and FX6. But you know, the main structure of the Sony cameras is fairly confusing if you've never shot on them. However, it's like learning to ride a bike. Now I can do it in my sleep and it's not really an issue, but I do remember my first impression of this menu system was no good. But to reliability, I've had the FX6 and I've ran it for almost 1,500 hours and I've had zero issues with it. The camera's a workhorse, and I always make the joke that it prints money. That camera is on almost every shoot, and with that many shoot hours on it, I've become very familiar with it. One thing that I like about the FX6 is the internal NDs, and one thing that I like about the FX3 is the internal IBIS. And this camera includes both of those, the internal ND and the IBIS. Now, I love the internal ND for obvious reasons, for logistics and just speed on set, and I love the internal stabilization. It takes out those micro jitters and really just helps polish the image. Another thing that sold me on this camera was industry reputation. Over the course of debating my next camera move, I talked to a bunch of different DPs that own Sony Buranos, and there's two that really stand out to me, and both of them own the Alexa LF and the Burano. Both of them told me that the Burano was working a lot more for them. The Burano was always on set, it was being requested by production, and then one of them actually told me that they were keeping their Burano and selling the LF because the ROI just wasn't there for them, which also made me think that we're seeing a shift in the industry. I think we're in a point at production where we're needing to produce so much that a lot of crews are having to produce very high quality content with less and less people. And having a system like the Sony Burano helps open up those doors. And so a lot of production companies are seeking out operators and DPs that are familiar or own the Sony Burano because they're familiar with the color science, they know what it can produce, and they know that this camera is not exclusively reserved for larger teams. With those conversations, I also talked to some documentary filmmakers, and I'm starting to see the Burano being used more and more on different documentaries. The FX9 is a great camera, and it has been the documentary camera for years, but I think what we're seeing is now this may become our next documentary camera. That being said, all of those conversations kind of helped steer me and push me back to the Burano, even though I was debating with other cameras. But I also want to talk about some downsides of the camera. Now, on my wish list for getting into a new system, I wanted OpenGate, and this obviously does not include OpenGate. I think with this sensor and the way that the internal ND is, I think the ND is a 16:9 if I'm not mistaken, so that obviously knocks the OpenGate aspect out of this. And then I talked with Sony when I was at NAB, and they said that this sensor was just not designed to read OpenGate. So not being able to shoot OpenGate was a downside for me. I wanted to be able to shoot OpenGate, especially for a lot of the commercial content that I'm producing. That way we can crop vertical, we can crop horizontal, we can crop square. You have a lot more real estate to work with. But that being said, after a lot of conversations and debating with myself, OpenGate wasn't the hill that I wanted to make my final stand on for this particular move at this time. Another downside could be the price of the system. Now, I got a decent deal on this one used, but I was very happy with how clean and how well taken care of this system was. But that being said, it is significantly more expensive than like a Pixis 12K. But after talking with different production houses and DPs, and then having the Ursa Cine 12K freeze on me 3 or 4 times whenever I rented it, that kind of sealed the deal with reliability and price. I knew getting into this system that I could trust the system to turn on whenever I needed it to turn on, record when I needed to record, so the reliability aspect played a huge role for me. Now, the last big downside, which I think is probably the biggest hickey of this camera, is the rolling shutter. Now, I talked to a lot of different people about this. I used it on my own sets, and honestly, when you're shooting in 6.8K in RAW, the rolling shutter is noticeable if you do whips, but if you're just shooting regular action, a lot of the times it's not a big deal. And in a lot of my productions, I'm not going to be shooting out of a window and, see the telephone poles going like this, or I'm not going to be doing a bunch of whip pans. And so, let's say for 98% of the shooting that I'm doing, the rolling shutter is really not that big of a deal. I think it's something that the internet latched onto, but talking with professionals and different people in the industry, the rolling shutter really isn't that big of a deal practically for a lot of productions. And that's kind of where I landed with the downsides. My buddy Steve, a director and production company owner, has one of these cameras, and so I've had pretty good access to it over the last 6 months, and that's the camera that I've been using. And honestly, after using this camera day in and day out on several different productions, a lot of those concerns just kind of melt away. Now I want to talk about the media that I'm choosing to use with this camera. Like I said, I bought the system used and it came with 2 different cards, both of those being Sony cards. Now, I like to record dual slot recording because I've seen people get burned in the past only recording on one card. That being said, anytime I have the option, I like the redundancy just for safety. But even though I had 2 cards, because I do dual slot recording, I needed another set of cards so that whenever one card is offloading at DIT, I could be shooting on the other set of cards. Now, whenever I started looking into different cards, one of my DIT buddies recommended that I check out OWC. He thought that they had a really good back end and that they offered a very good price per value for what you were getting with the cards. So while I was at NAB, I stopped and talked with him. Now, one thing that I asked them about was why their cards were not VPG 400 rated. And although I don't necessarily have an exact answer of why they're not VPG 400 rated, if that's coming or whatever, they did explain a little bit of the back end of what VPG 400 meant, which was really enlightening for me. So basically what VPG 400 means is that it can have a sustained write speed of 400 megabytes a second. And then we have VPG 200, which is 200 megabytes a second. But the camera really likes to have VPG 400 cards. Now, on the back end, there's like a small digital token that goes onto the card, and whenever you insert the card that has the VPG 400 digital token, the camera recognizes that and then understands that the card does have those write speeds guaranteed. And then if you insert a card that does not have that, the camera says, whoa, that VPG 400 token's not there, and so it gives you a warning on the camera that says card not officially supported. But that's okay if you realize what's going on in the back end. So the OWC cards actually outperform VPG 400 standards. So that being said, understanding the back end behind these cards really helped me make my decision. Now, while I was at NAB, I was just starting my channel, and in fact, the channel kind of took off with my NAB video, which was really cool. But I just told them, hey, you know, I'm looking at getting into a new system, and they said, hey, hit us up whenever you decide, and we can send you a couple cards to try out. And so they did send me these cards, but that's not why I'm using them. I'm using them because of a conversation that I had with my DIT. Something really cool about these cards is if you use the cards with their reader, it gives you access to the OWC Energize app, which basically lets you check the health of the card, as well as apply firmware updates and monitor performance. Now that's something that's really important to me because whenever I've seen cards fail in the past, it's probably because they're too old and past their life cycle. And that was probably the biggest selling point for me. If you're not just on top of your cards and monitoring every time they record, it's really easy to lose track of how old the cards are, how many write cycles they have, etc. So being able to check the health and performance of these cards is very important to me because without a healthy card, your shoot is a bust at the end of the day. Now I want to talk about how I've rigged out the camera. To start off, I have the Tilt-A-Cage with the EVF mount. Now this cage is not flawless, but after doing some research and looking at other cages, this is the one that I settled on. Now the cage isn't perfect. I don't love how it uses the Tilta standard dovetail over the Arri standard, but that's to be expected because it's Tilta. That's something that I've always struggled with Tilta cages. But what I do love about it is that everything is very well machined. Everything's smooth, there's no rough edges. All the locks work very well, they're tight. And then in addition, I love how they include this little side shelf. This side shelf has been perfect for my SDR transmitter. Now for me, I designed and printed this dummy NPF battery that the DJI SDR slides onto. I did a video on the DJI SDR if you want to check that out. I have a bunch of different thoughts on it. I've used Teradek and Vaxis, but I keep coming back to this SDR system because of its versatility with apps and its long range. Now something else that I included was the Tilta battery distribution box. I really like the design of this because it has a battery indicator on the side, it has a PD power delivery which is perfect for my SDR, a PTAP, as well as a 5-pin LiMo in. Now something that I don't love about that is that it doesn't give battery information to the camera. So whenever I plug in my Core or my Anton Bauer, it shows on the camera the percentage and how many minutes you have left. Now if you plug a battery into the power distribution box, it doesn't give any of that information on the camera, so you just have to keep an eye on your voltage and your percentage off the display on your battery. Another accessory that I've added to this is the Mid49 screen protector. Now I printed this a few times in PLA and I had some issues with heat and warping, so I printed this last version in TPU and I've had really good luck with it, just to help protect it in moves around set or to and from set from accidental bumps and breaks, and they provide that as a free download. So overall, as I reflect on different cameras that I thought through, I feel like this camera matches where the industry is going. This camera is a Swiss Army knife. It can do large sets, it can do docu-style stuff, it can do corporate and small commercials. But if you're in the market for a camera, I think it really comes down to your needs. You can spend all day spec chasing, but it's really about what camera helps you work more efficiently and more confidently in the jobs that you're getting and the jobs that you want to get. All that being said, the Burano, of course, is not a perfect camera, but for me, it was the right call. It checks the boxes of reliability, versatility, and quality. I'm sharing my journey and what I've learned along the way. If you want to continue growing together, consider subscribing. This is just the beginning of the conversation.